Imagine you're driving deep into the Congolese rainforest. Not the version from travel brochures. The real one? The road is dirt and broken stone. The air is heavy enough to feel like a wet blanket. Every kilometer forward feels like you're moving further away from the modern world, further from banks, airports, embassies, headlines. And then you turn a corner, and the jungle suddenly gives way to something unnatural. A towering, glittering billboard. Not Coca-Cola, not the United Nations, it's not a European NGO logo you've seen 1,000 times. It's a construction sign. It's 2 languages, French and Mandarin. In that moment, your brain does a quiet double take, because this isn't just a road project. It's a footprint, a signal, a claim, something telling you, without ever saying it out loud, power has arrived here before you even noticed it was moving. While the West argued about elections, inflation, identity wars, and the next scandal, China did something less dramatic and more consequential. It built relationships that don't trend on social media. It built trade. It built ports. It built highways and fiber optic arteries. It built a $280 billion trade relationship with Africa, number so large it stops feeling real until you remember what trade actually is: dependency, leverage, and the quiet rewriting of the future. And now, here we are standing at the edge of the biggest geopolitical shift of the 21st century, trying to understand how it happened. Because 50 years ago, China wasn't a global financier. 50 years ago, China was struggling to feed itself. So how does a country go from ration lines to rewriting supply chains across an entire continent? How did China displace the United States and Europe? Not through invasion, not through conquest, but through something more modern: loans, concrete, contracts, influence. And the question that follows is sharper than most people want to admit. Is this a genuine partnership? A win-win story of development and dignity? Or is it the most sophisticated dependency machine ever built, one railway, one port, one loan at a time? To answer that, we have to do something most headlines don't. We have to stop thinking in slogans, debt trap versus development, and start thinking in mechanisms. Because power today doesn't always look like soldiers and flags. Sometimes it looks like a port where customs systems are tied to foreign contractors, a railway that can't pay for itself but still has to be repaid, a loan whose money never enters your treasuries, only your obligations, a telecom network so embedded in your country's nervous system that replacing it becomes impossible. In the 20th century, empires painted maps. In the 21st century, they built infrastructure and let the map keep its colors. That's why this story begins in a rainforest, with a sign you weren't supposed to see. Because what you're looking at is not a random project. It's the visible edge of an invisible system, a system with a memory. And like all powerful systems, it didn't start with profit. It started with a story. A symbolic act so expensive, so irrational on paper, that it only makes sense when you realize the true currency being traded wasn't money. It was loyalty. To understand the ports, highways, stadiums, and digital networks stretching across Africa today, you have to go back to a time when China wasn't an economic superpower. You have to go back to a time when China could barely keep its own lights on. The mid-1960s. The Cold War is frozen solid. Africa is newly independent, and the old colonial roots still control the flow of wealth. In East and Southern Africa, to leaders Tanzania, S. Julius Nyerere, and Zambia S. Kenneth Kaunda face a problem that sounds technical but is actually existential. Zambia is landlocked, sitting on vast copper reserves, its economic lifeline. But the rail routes to the sea run through Rhodesia and Apartheid-Tira. South Africa, white minority regimes openly hostile to African independence movements, meaning Zambia's wealth is trapped behind hostile gates. Its economy is being strangled, politely, bureaucratically, through infrastructure. So they try the West. They pitch a bold idea to the World Bank, to the United States, to the United Kingdom: a railway, 1,600 kilometers, from Zambia's copper belt to the Tanzanian port of Dar es Salaam. A freedom line, a way out. The response is blunt: too expensive, too risky, too ambitious, unviable, not worth it. In other words, stay in the system we built for you. For Nyerere and Kaunda, it's not just rejection, it's humiliation. And then they do something that sets off alarm bells in Washington. They fly to Beijing. At the time, China is in the Cultural Revolution. Its economy is weak. Food shortages are real. It is not the China you imagine today. And yet Chairman Mao sees what Western bankers didn't. Not a balance sheet, a strategic opening. A once-in-a-generation chance to become the friend Africa remembers. China agrees at great sacrifice, and then it follows through. Tens of thousands of Chinese engineers and workers arrive alongside tens of thousands of African laborers. They tunnel through mountains, bridge flood-prone rivers, cut through dense bush where lions, malaria, and tsetse flies make every workday feel like a gamble. The cost is staggering, hundreds of millions in 1970s dollars, billions today. The human toll is real. And when the railway finally opens, it does something no loan document can fully capture. It creates a memory. A story China can point to decades later and say, "We were there when no one else came." This is how influence begins. Not with domination, with presence. And that's why the first chapter matters so much. Because that railway romantic, symbolic, costly, wasn't just infrastructure. It was a prototype, a loss leader, an investment in long-term access. A foundation for a model that would evolve into something colder, sharper, and far more scalable. A model where the question is no longer friendship. It's repayment. And in the next section, we move from the romance of the Freedom Railway to the hard math of oil. Because the next time China came knocking, it didn't just want partnership, it wanted resources. And it was willing to redesign the rules of development finance to get them. The Tazara Railway was the beginning, the romantic chapter. A story China could tell for decades. Sacrifice, solidarity, anti-colonial friendship. A physical monument of we helped when the West refused. But history has a pattern. The first gift is about trust. The second deal is about leverage. Fast forward to 2002. We land in Luanda, Angola, and the mood is not hope. It's exhaustion. Angola has just crawled out of a 27-year civil war. The country is fractured. Roads are cratered, bridges are broken, and unexploded ordnance still hides in the soil like a delayed sentence. Luandans, built for a fraction of the people now living there, has swollen into a vast, chaotic sprawl as refugees flood in from the interior, stacking life on top of life in informal settlements. This is what post-war reconstruction looks like in the real world. Not inspiring speeches, but desperate arithmetic. Angola needs billions now. Highways, hospitals, power plants, ports, housing. The things a country must build before it can even start functioning like a country again. So Angola does what many post-conflict states do. It goes to the traditional gatekeepers. The IMF, the World Bank, Western donor nations. And the West responds in the language it believes is responsible. Conditions. Yes, we can lend you money. But first, transparency. Anti-corruption measures. Human rights improvements. Full auditing of oil revenues. Fiscal oversight. It's the old conditionality script. The parent talking to the teenager. Eat your vegetables before you get dessert. The problem is Angola isn't hungry for vegetables. Angola is hungry for reconstruction. And while negotiations drag on, while committees argue about governance frameworks, while Angola is asked to prove it can be trusted before it can rebuild, China walks into the room with a different offer. No lectures, no audits, no speeches about virtue. Just a sentence that sounds almost obscene in its simplicity. We'll take the oil. This moment is where the relationship changes shape. This is the birth of what became known as the Angola Model Resource-Backed Infrastructure Financing, and it quietly reshaped development finance across the global South. Here's the mechanism, step by step, because this is where people get confused. The power isn't in the kindness. The power is in the structure. Step 1. The loan. In 2004, China's state-owned Export-Import Bank extends Angola an initial $2 billion line of credit, backed by future oil deliveries. Over time, these credit lines expand into the tens of billions. Step 2. The loop. The money doesn't flow into Angola's treasury like a normal development loan. Instead, funds flow from Beijing directly to Chinese state-owned construction firms operating inside Angola, companies like China Road and Bridge Corporation. So Angola receives money, but never fully holds it. It receives projects, it receives concrete, It receives visible reconstruction, the kind that photographs well, the kind that can be inaugurated in time for elections. Step 3. The work. Chinese firms build roads, rail lines, hospitals, housing blocks, and power infrastructure, often at remarkable speed. And speed matters in politics. Because in fragile states, legitimacy is not a philosophy, it's an outcome. People don't ask for perfection first. They ask, can you deliver anything? Step 4. Repayment. Angola repays the loans with oil shipped via the state oil company to Chinese buyers in agreed volumes. This removes currency risk. It reduces missed payment drama. It bypasses the IMF's oversight ecosystem. To Angola's political leadership, the model feels almost magical. Reconstruction without scrutiny. Visibility without constraint. To China, it is a strategic masterstroke. Long-term energy supply for a rapidly industrializing economy. Plus, guaranteed multi-billion-dollar construction contracts often paid before the first road is poured. And now we reach the part the billboards don't show. The hidden price of no questions asked. Many contracts included provisions, formal or informal, that large shares of labor, materials, and management would come from China. So Angola gets infrastructure, but local job creation is often weaker than promised. And that creates a new kind of resentment. Not the old colonial resentment of foreign rulers, but the modern resentment of foreign workers building your future while your own people watch from the roadside. This contradiction becomes a symbol in one place more than anywhere else. Calamba, New City. A gleaming, planned city built by a Chinese state company, often described as costing roughly $3.5 billion. High-rise apartment blocks, paved streets, utilities, a slice of modernity dropped onto the African landscape, and for years, sits largely empty. Because the apartments are priced far above what ordinary Angolans can afford. Western media calls it a ghost city. The image spreads because it's visually perfect. Modern towers, quiet streets, no life. Over time, occupancy rises through subsidies and policy adjustments, but the symbol sticks. Infrastructure without inclusion. And yet, despite these flaws, the Angola model works at least for elites, and China exports it. Copper and cobalt deals. Bauxite, minerals, transport corridors, rail networks. Fast, transactional, politically convenient. But when you scale a model, you scale its risk, because a loan tied to oil feels stable, until oil prices move. A project financed by debt feels manageable, until growth slows. And when the bill comes due, the country doesn't just owe money. It owes policy space. It owes future options. And this is where the story starts to turn from infrastructure to entrapment, not always in the dramatic Hollywood sense, but in the subtler sense, a nation slowly discovering that the future has already been pre-spent. In the next chapter, we move to a different kind of ambition. Not survival, not rebuilding, but ego. A mega-project sold as destiny, and a debt burden that can box a country into a corner. Because the Angola model taught Beijing something powerful. If you control the financing and the builders, you don't just build roads, you build dependence. And then the Belt and Road era arrives and the scale explodes. If the Angola model was born out of necessity, the next chapter was driven by something far more dangerous: ambition. We move east to Kenya, 2017, and into the heart of the Belt and Road era. For more than a century, the main rail link between Kenya's coast and its interior had been a relic of empire, a slow, aging colonial line running from Mombasa toward Nairobi. It worked barely, but it symbolized everything post-colonial leaders wanted to escape. So when President Uhuru Kenyatta unveiled the Standard Gauge Railway, or SGR, it wasn't marketed as a transport project. It was marketed as destiny, a modern steel artery that would slash transit times, lower logistics costs, and transform Kenya into East Africa's commercial hub. A crown jewel of China's Belt and Road Initiative on the continent. China Road and Bridge Corporation built it. Chinese financing backed it. And here's where the story always pauses at the price. The SGR program in Kenya is widely reported to have cost around $4.7 billion in Chinese loans, with the flagship Mombasa-Nairobi segment alone often cited in the $3 billion range depending on what S counted. For a developing country, that's not a big number, it's a defining one. Critics didn't just argue the railway was expensive. They argued it was overpriced. Multiple analyses questioned the procurement process, the lack of competitive tendering, and feasibility studies that, after the fact, looked wildly optimistic about freight demand and revenue. To be fair, the engineering was real. The railway runs through environmentally sensitive zones, including areas near Tsavo National Park. Massive mitigation works were built, elevated viaducts, wildlife crossings to reduce disruption to animal migration. The ribbon was cut, speeches were given, and then the hangover began. Financially, the SGR struggled to live up to its promise. Reports repeatedly described it as underperforming relative to the debt used to build it testerly, unless it could be extended deeper into the region to capture larger freight flows. And when the railway didn't naturally attract enough cargo, the government did what governments often do when megaprojects don't pay for themselves. It leaned on policy pressure. Directives pushed freight from trucks onto rail, triggering backlash from trucking companies and logistics operators who suddenly found themselves forced into an economic experiment they didn't choose. Then came the rumor that turned the SGR into a global cautionary tale. That Kenya had pledged the port of Mombasa as collateral land, that if it defaulted, China would seize it. The story went viral. Headlines exploded. China, the narrative said, was waiting like a repo man ready to take the keys. Here's the reality. The China will take the port story is heavily disputed and often overstated. What is well documented is that Chinese loan agreements often include tough creditor protections, sovereign waivers, dispute resolution clauses, and legal language that critics argue could expose national assets in extreme scenarios. But reputable analyses caution that the idea of an automatic port takeover is far more complex and far less cinematic than viral headlines suggest. And this brings us to the core misunderstanding about China's Africa strategy. Because the real question isn't, is China trying to seize ports? The better question is, what kind of leverage actually matters? Which leads us into the most controversial accusation of all. Debt trap diplomacy, myth, mechanism, or misreading. The popular version of the debt trap story is simple and emotionally satisfying. China lends money for a project it knows won't work. The country can't repay. China swoops in, seizes a port, airport, or mine. Sovereignty lost. Game over. This narrative went global after Sri Lanka's Hambantota port lease, but Africa is not Sri Lanka. And the evidence on the continent tells a more complicated story. Let's examine one of the most cited African cases, Uganda's Entebbe International Airport. In 2021, headlines claimed China could seize Uganda's primary international gateway due to loan repayment struggles. Panic spread, social media filled with warnings. But when independent researchers reviewed the loan documents, the reality was far less dramatic. There was no verified clause automatically handing the airport to China upon default. Chinese diplomats explicitly denied asset seizure. So what's actually happening? Here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no documented case in Africa where China has outright seized a government-owned port, airport, or national asset due to debt default. Instead, Chinese lenders, like many creditors, tend to restructure, extend maturities, or renegotiate terms when borrowers struggle. That doesn't mean there's no leverage. It means the leverage is financial, not theatrical. The real trap isn't losing your airport, it's losing your negotiating power. Many Chinese loans include confidentiality clauses, revenue ring-fencing, or collateral structures that quietly limit a country's fiscal flexibility. Some require export revenues to be set aside in special accounts. Others prioritize Chinese lenders during restructuring talks. The result is subtle but powerful. When debt becomes unsustainable, governments often find themselves forced to weigh every decision against one question: what will Beijing say? This dynamic played out clearly in Zambia, the first African country to default during the COVID-era debt crisis. China was one of Zambia's largest bilateral creditors. Yet China didn't seize copper mines. It didn't take over infrastructure. Instead, debt restructuring became slow, opaque, and complicated, delaying broader relief from other creditors. And here's another truth often ignored in Western narratives. China is not Africa's largest overall creditor. African debt is spread across Western banks, bond markets, multilateral institutions, and private lenders. Chinese loans are significant, but they rarely dominate a country's entire debt profile. So if the Hollywood debt trap story doesn't fully hold, what's the real concern? It's opacity. It's influence. It's the quiet accumulation of leverage through contracts most citizens never see. Not a repo man with a clipboard, but a spreadsheet that limits a nation's future choices. And while the world is obsessed with railways and ports, something even more consequential has been happening in parallel. Something less visible. Something that doesn't rust. Because while steel defines borders, data defines power. And in the next section, we step away from concrete hand into Africa's digital nervous system. Because China didn't just build Africa's roads, it helped build its networks. And once you control the network, you don't need to seize anything. While politicians argue over ports and railways, China has been building something far more intimate. Africa's nervous system. If you're watching this on a smartphone, anywhere on the continent, there's a strong chance your data has passed through Chinese-built infrastructure cell towers. Fiber optic cables, network switches, surveillance nodes. This is what Beijing calls the digital Silk Road. And unlike a railway, you don't see it coming. Huawei and the logic of speed, the central actor here is Huawei. As the United States and parts of Europe moved to restrict Huawei over national security concerns, African governments were moving in the opposite direction, signing contracts. Why? Because Huawei offered three things Western firms often didn't: lower prices, end-to-end solutions, financing bundled with the technology. If you're a president in Senegal, Ethiopia, or Rwanda and you want nationwide 4G coverage before the next election, Western firms might quote you a high price and tell you to find your own financing. Huawei might quote less and arrive with a policy bank ready to fund the deal. In politics, speed beats purity. Today, Chinese firms are involved in building or upgrading telecom networks in more than half of African countries. Not just equipment, but maintenance, software updates, training, and long-term technical dependence. This is influence that doesn't need speeches. It runs quietly, in the background, every time a call connects. From connectivity to control. But the digital Silk Road doesn't stop at phones. China has also exported safe city systems, large-scale urban surveillance networks to cities like Nairobi, Johannesburg, Kampala, and Addis Ababa. Thousands of cameras, centralized command centers, AI-assisted video analytics, facial recognition. The pitch is simple: public safety. And in some cases, it works. Certain monitored zones report faster emergency response times and reduced street crime. But here's the Black Mirror turn. The same system that catches criminals can track journalists, activists, and political opponents. In Zimbabwe, facial recognition technology developed in partnership with Chinese firms sparked warnings from civil society groups about its potential use in monitoring protests. This phenomenon has a name now: digital authoritarianism. China doesn't need to pull the strings directly. It exports the tools, the cameras, the software, the data architecture. And then it steps back. Because China's doctrine is non-interference, no democracy clauses, no human rights lectures, no sanctions threats. If a government uses the technology to reduce crime, China invoices. If it uses the same technology to suppress dissent, China still invoices. This is the trade-off. There is no public evidence that Beijing directly controls African surveillance systems at scale. But dependence on Chinese hardware, software, and maintenance creates long-term leverage that doesn't show up in debt statistics. Still, for millions of young Africans, this debate feels distant. Privacy is abstract. Connectivity is real. The digital Silk Road brought smartphones, mobile banking, online education, and global access to regions the West ignored for decades. Which leads to a different question Western analysts often miss. What good is the internet if you can't afford the phone to use it? The invisible phone king. Quick question: who is the biggest smartphone seller in Africa? Not Apple, not Samsung. It's a company most Western consumers have never heard of: Transsion Holdings. They own Tecno, Infinix, and Itel. Walk through Lagos, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, or Kinshasa. These phones are everywhere. In Africa, Transsion controls roughly 40 to 45% of the smartphone market, often outselling Samsung and Apple combined. How? By doing something radical. They listened. Western tech companies treated Africa as a dumping ground for last year's devices. Transsion treated it like a distinct, intelligent consumer base. They optimized cameras for darker skin tones, fixing a real problem that early smartphone photography consistently failed at. They prioritized multi-SIM functionality because people juggle multiple networks to save money. They built massive batteries that last days because electricity isn't guaranteed. And yes, this detail matters. They even developed acid-resistant keypads for feature phones because staple foods in parts of East Africa were down-printed numbers over time. This isn't luxury design. This is anthropological engineering. And it worked. Transsion didn't sell status. It sold tools. And in doing so, it quietly captured hearts, minds, and market share without a single billboard in Times Square. This matters because power today isn't just about who builds your bridges. It's about who designs the object you hold in your hand all day, who controls your access to information, who becomes normal. But steel and software aren't enough on their own, because influence needs protection. And that brings us to the moment that made Washington truly nervous. A tiny strip of land, a global choke point. And the first time China planted a permanent military footprint on the continent. In the next section, we move from phones to warships, from fiber cables to flight decks. Because when a lender builds a base next to your ally's base, the story is no longer just economic. It's strategic. If you want to understand why Washington's tone changed, don't look at trade statistics. Look at a map. A tiny, sun-scorched strip of land in the Horn of Africa called Djibouti. Imagine you're a U.S. fighter pilot stationed at Camp Lemonnier, America's primary military base on the continent. You take off over the blue waters of the Gulf of Aden. To your left, a French base. To your right, a Japanese base. And then just a few miles away, close enough to make generals uncomfortably see something new. High walls, watchtowers, a deep-water pier capable of docking large naval vessels. This is China's first overseas military base, officially labeled the PLA Logistics Support Facility. That phrase is doing a lot of work, because logistics facilities don't usually include hardened ammunition storage. Large troop barracks, helicopter pads, and berths designed for destroyers and amphibious assault ships. This wasn't a warehouse, it was a forward operating base. For decades, China insisted it would never build overseas military base, discreditizing the United States for what it framed as imperial overreach. Then, in 2017, under the banner of anti-piracy operations, real concerns given Somali piracy, China crossed a line. And in doing so, it sent a message that echoed far beyond Djibouti. We are no longer just builders. We are protectors of our interests. In 2018, the Pentagon accused Chinese personnel of directing military-grade lasers at U.S. aircraft approaching Camp Lemonnier, temporarily injuring pilots' eyes. China denied it, but the incident wasn't really about lasers. It was about proximity. Two nuclear powers operating major military installations just miles apart with no buffer, no trust, and no shared assumptions. Africa had quietly become a theater of great power competition. Before Djibouti, China had a strategic problem. If unrest broke out threatening Chinese workers, oil facilities, or infrastructure, Beijing had to project power from thousands of miles away. After Djibouti, it was already there. The base allows China to escort shipping, evacuate citizens, protect belt and road assets, and support naval operations in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. When instability flared in Sudan, Chinese warships didn't need permission. They just sailed. The message to African governments was unmistakable. We aren't just your lenders anymore. We're physically present and we're staying. And Washington's deeper fear wasn't Djibouti itself. It was what might come next. U.S. defense analysts have warned about potential Chinese access to the Atlantic, discussions with countries like Equatorial Guinea over a possible naval facility. If China ever establishes a permanent Atlantic base, it wouldn't just alter African geopolitics. It would bring Chinese naval power within operational reach of the U.S. East Coast. That's not paranoia. That's planning. But steel and ships are only part of the picture. Because the next battleground isn't ports, it's batteries. Cobalt, corruption, and the green illusion travel inland to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to the red earth of Lualaba province. If you own a smartphone, a laptop, or an electric vehicle, there's a high chance a critical component began life here. This region holds the world's largest cobalt reserves, essential for most lithium-ion batteries. China dominates this supply chain. The DRC produces roughly 70% of the world's cobalt. Chinese firms control most industrial mining operations and refine up to 80% of global cobalt output. Not just extraction, processing. That's where leverage lives. The deal that defined this era was signed in 2008, the Sycamines Agreement. Up to $3 billion in infrastructure in exchange for vast copper and cobalt concessions. On paper, it looked like a Marshall Plan. In reality, audits years later revealed a brutal imbalance. Minerals flowed out. Infrastructure lagged behind. Projects delayed, downsized, or quietly abandoned. Corruption, weak oversight, opaque accounting on both sides. And beneath the spreadsheets lies the human cost. Artisanal miners' entire families digging by hand. Children in collapsing tunnels. Toxic dust, contaminated rivers. This is the hidden underside of the green transition. Carbon footprints shrink. Moral footprints expand. The West now admits it miscalculated. While it focused on finance and services, China locked down mining, refining, logistics, and battery precursors. Trying to unwind that dominance now is like trying to remove sugar from a baked cake. It's already embedded. Stories, screens, and the shape of the future. China's influence isn't just material, psychological. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, built entirely by China as a gift, became a symbol of that. When reports emerged that data from the building servers may have been quietly exfiltrated for years, there was no diplomatic explosion. No sanctions, no rupture. Because by then, the relationship was too deep to unwind. You don't accuse your largest financier in public. Power isn't just about money, it's about stories. Satellite TV, cultural institutes, scholarships, media narratives. For millions of Africans, the first global story they encounter doesn't come from London or Washington. It comes from Beijing. And while critics argue about propaganda, the effect is subtler. It's normalization. And normalization shapes loyalty. The new Cold War and Africa's unexpected advantage for years. The West dismissed China's presence as cheap vanity projects. By the time it realized what was happening, China didn't just have a seat at the table. It owned the building. Now, the West is back. G7 infrastructure initiatives. Competing corridors. Minerals pulled west instead of east. Steel tracks pointing in opposite directions, leading to a different sphere of influence. Okay. But here's the most important shift. African leaders are no longer passive. They've learned from the last Cold War. This time, many are practicing strategic non-alignment. Chinese highways in the morning. Western tech investment meetings in the evening. Competition is leverage. And for the first time in decades, many African states are negotiating not from desperation, but from choice. China is changing too. Unlimited lending is over. Beijing is moving toward smaller, revenue-generating projects. More cautious, more selective. Africa is no longer a monopoly. It's a marketplace. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Is China Africa's savior or its colonizer? The honest answer is uncomfortable. It depends. It depends on where you stand. And that's the truth that makes this moment historic. Africa is no longer something to be owned, something to be chosen. And for the first time in modern history, that choice, while constrained, is genuinely theirs. The empire isn't retreating quietly. But neither is Africa standing still.